Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming, and welcome. I am Michael Waldman. I'm the president of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. For those of you who don't know the Brennan Center, we are a nonpartisan law and policy institute. We focus on reforming and revitalizing the systems of democracy and justice in the United States. We have our own sound effects that we bring for those issues. We were started by and named after the late, great Supreme Court Justice William Brennan. And we take from him and hope to carry forward his spirit and his concept that the ultimate aim of a legal system, the ultimate value embedded in the Constitution, is that of human dignity. We work on issues ranging from the growing and corrosive role of money in politics, to the scandal of mass incarceration in the United States, to the issue that is keeping us busy and up late these days, which is what we at least perceive to be and believe to be an assault on voting in the United States. Some of my colleagues couldn't be here because last week we were a part of the team that litigated the challenge to the voter identification law in Texas. And a 3-week trial produced a very compelling ruling that the voter ID law affected minorities, affected the poor, and in fact was a new poll tax. About 2 hours ago, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals said that nonetheless the ID law should be applied to this election. So my colleagues are looking up the zip code for the Supreme Court. I believe that's not a statement of fact, but
20002.
Unfortunately, that's all we know. That's the kind of thing the Brennan Center works on. We're really grateful to all of you for being a part of it. So many of you work with us and know us, and we are really, really grateful to be able to hold this event with Mother Jones Magazine. Mother Jones, of course, is one of the preeminent investigative journalism and analysis organs in the country over many, many years. It's got 8 million readers a month. It provides up-to-the-minute news coverage and long-form journalism of a kind that still makes a very significant difference. And I believe I speak for Mother Jones also in thanking our friend and the friend of Mother Jones, Lily Shai of Chicago, who sort of served as the matchmaker for this event and encouraged us to look at what's going on in this election. Tonight we will be talking about the midterms. I can remember few elections where there was, at some level, less passion and less intense anticipation than I can think of for this one. It is hard to sometimes trace where a country is, where this country is, in the middle of the stream, to understand where we are and where the narrative arc is for the country. And whatever fevered dreams and imaginings political consultants or political candidates might have had about what this election campaign would turn on, this has been so far the summer and the year of Ebola and ISIS, of Ferguson, of falling unemployment and rising economic anxiety, and a time of, at the very least, puzzlement in the country. So we are going to try to look ahead. We're going to take as our guiding spirit the Governor Tom Dewey of New York, who said, "The future lies ahead." We're going to ask what that means for the country. We're going to ask, first of all, about this election. A little bit of prognostication. We have some very, very skilled assessors of political horseflesh here. But we also not only want to talk about who's going to win, but why, and what really is going on in the election. But we also then want to turn to the next 2 years, to the last 2 years of the Obama presidency, to ask what it might mean. Is it destined to be more gridlock? Will it be more confrontation? Will there be unexpected progress? Will there be, and I emphasize unexpected.
I'm sorry.
Will there be surprisingly wonderful or unexpectedly calamitous negotiations and compromises? What will it possibly mean? And with a little bit of the benefit of history. And then we will look forward actually with perhaps a ray of light and a ray of optimism, because right now, this moment is not only the election, it's not only the beginning of the next 2 years, which may feel like 20, but it's the beginning of a new political era. The 2016 campaign has begun almost in earnest, and in fact, this can be a time of replenishment, of intellectual replenishment. Both parties at some level feel, at least seem, intellectually exhausted. The agendas for both parties, the cupboard is bare. And that actually can be a time when there's turmoil and ferment, creativity and new thinking. And we're going to ask about what that might look like too. Before I introduce our panel, I do want to put one more bit of historic context here as people think about what the election might look like, and to caution against over-interpreting potentially what it might mean as well. The second midterm of a two-term president has as close to a curse or a jinx as anything there is in American politics. It is very, very common for people to be tired of whatever the administration is, even to turn out the party in power in Congress. But it doesn't mean the end of political debate and dialogue. But I'll point out that it was in 1958, Dwight Eisenhower was at 41% approval. His party lost 29 seats in the House and 6 in the Senate. Ronald Reagan in 1986 was at 64% approval, very different. His party lost 5 seats in the House and 8 seats in the Senate, and the Democrats took control of the Senate that year. Bill Clinton was unusual. He was at 65% and getting impeached, and he gained 5 seats in the House and didn't lose any seats in the Senate. That was the first time in decades, maybe ever, that had happened in a second term of a president. George W. Bush was at 37% approval in 2006. His party lost 30 seats in the House and 6 in the Senate. We don't know, of course, what's going to happen. The future lies ahead. But President Obama is sort of in the median there. He's at 43% approval. So whatever happens, there will be a historical precedent for it. To tell us about that, we have a fantastic panel. To my immediate left, as probably all of you know, is Alex Wagner. Alex is one of the most dynamic, compelling people on television today. I'm biased.
I paid you well to say that.
Well, even so, it's true. She is the host of MSNBC's Now with Alex Wagner. She is a former New Yorker. She was the editor-in-chief of the Fader magazine, which is a really wonderful Bible of culture and cutting-edge analysis, and makes her already twice as cool, at least, as I am, and I might suggest maybe some of the others. She was a fellow at the Center for American Progress, and it really has deep insight into all of this. To her left, at one level, is Robert George. He is an editorial writer for the New York Post. He's the editor of the libertarian and conservative blog Ragged Thoughts, if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
That is correct.
And he was an aide to Newt Gingrich and an official of the Republican Party when Speaker Gingrich and his colleagues won control of the Congress. And I have been ordered to note, but would have done so anyway, that he is a stand-up comedian and an improviser. And he hosts a weekly political improv show, Electoral Dysfunction, Saturdays at the People's Improv Theater. And we're all going to troop right over there. And finally, to his left is David Corn. David, as you probably know, is the Washington, D.C. bureau chief for Mother Jones. He was a longtime writer and editor for The Nation, the author of numerous books on topics ranging from George W. Bush's presidency to the history of the CIA. He was awarded in 2012 the George Polk Award in journalism for something that had actually a considerable amount of significance, which was he broke the story of Mitt Romney's 47% comments. And we're grateful to have David here, and I should note that in a much, much earlier life, we actually shared an office for about a year. What happens there stays there. So I want to start with a question for all of you, which is, in retrospect, you can look at an election and see what it was about. What is this election about? It seems not to have broad national themes, but perhaps that's wrong. As you look at the election, what do you see going on? And I'll ask each of you to sort of broadly weigh in.
You want to go
David?
first,
Yeah.
Alex? I mean, to me, it seems to be about apathy, in that midterm elections are notorious for low voter turnout. Both sides, when there's particularly not when there's not a presidential race going on, but the numbers this year are even lower than usual. Gallup came out with a poll just a couple of days ago, and I'll just give you a few examples from this. If you ask people if they're enthusiastic about voting, 37% say yes. That compares to 46% in 2010, the last midterm election. Extremely motivated to vote, that's 32% compared to 45%, again, 2010. And the bad news about this, beyond the impact on the civil discourse overall, for Democrats, is that there is a tremendous split between D's and R's on enthusiasm for voting, in which the Democrats are even less enthusiastic than the average American. So if you ask, are you motivated to vote, people who are Republican or say they lean Republican, it's 44% say they are extremely motivated to vote. Only 25% Democrats told Gallup that. That is a 19-point differential. So whatever's happening out there, the American public seems to be kind of in a funk. The economy is certainly better than it was 6 years ago, not as good as people want it to be, but the wrong direction number, that's what pollsters, they ask you, do you think the country's going in the right direction, the wrong direction? The wrong direction number is very high, as Michael mentioned earlier. Economic anxiety is still pronounced. People are worried about ISIS. They don't want to send troops in, but they want the president somehow to take care of this. They're worried about Ebola, probably more so than they should be compared to the enterovirus D68. So there's a lot going on that seems to indicate the public is feeling a lot of unease, and at the same time, it's not translating, I think, into any major themes in the campaign cycle, in that the Republicans basically are running without presenting any grand ideas. There's no two-page contract with America that Robert might have worked on in 1994. It was only...
I can neither confirm nor deny.
It was 2 pages, but it was at least a set of ideas that Newt Gingrich was putting forward. It really is Republicans running to get their base out because they don't like Obama, and Democrats basically running against Republican obstructionism, but without doing it in a way that's creating any degree of engagement with people who were quite engaged 6 years ago, and to a lesser extent 2 years ago. So it's a very unusual election in that we'll have a small body of people voting, some who care a lot, but it's not reflective of the populace at large, and we can then talk about the input of, the impact of money in this and the voter registration laws. All these things, I think, whether we agree with them or not, I think we can agree that when you have a fewer number of people voting, these sort of factors, money being spent and attempts to create laws that affect people's right to vote, can have more impact with a smaller number of people. So I think this is going to be an election with a lot of asterisks, a lot of odd bounces. There are some real crazy races out there. We can go over some of that. But it's hard to find, like with pudding, it's hard to find a real theme.
This election is like pudding. That's your takeaway, everyone. Do you want to go? Or
I guess I'll go since
We're being very frugal with our microphones. We want everybody to respect that.
Well, since I sort of feel like I may be presenting, no pun intended, the minority opinion here, I guess I'll start with that. I somewhat agree with David that. Well, I wouldn't call this a pudding election. I might want to call it a Seinfeld election, and it doesn't seem to be much doing. It seems to be about nothing, nothing completely focused. It is quite true that in midterms, voters tend to tune out, except for the most partisan individuals. And usually, that means that's usually an advantage for the party that doesn't have the White House, and that's been true historically, as Michael said. 1998 was a very notable exception because when otherwise all other the usual factors would have held, somebody came up with the great idea of trying to impeach a popular president, and that actually energized the president's partisans, and as Michael said, that translated into some Democratic wins in the House, and actually to the resignation of my former boss, Newt Gingrich. I'd already left by then, actually, so I was okay. What's happening this time around, though, I think there are a couple of things that are going on. Michael pointed out that technically speaking, the economy is maybe not going great guns the way it was in 1998, which helped Bill Clinton's popularity. But unemployment has dropped below 6%. It's 5.9%. There's been a lengthy period of private sector job creation. But the fact is, the president doesn't seem to be getting the usual credit for this, and I kind of came up with an idea as to why that's happening. It's maybe a little bit offbeat, but right before this, David and I were talking about baseball, and I think Barack Obama has sort of become victim to the sabermetricization of the economy. When I was growing up, if you wanted to know if a baseball player was doing well, you would look at batting average, home runs, RBI, and if he was somebody who just did hits and stolen bases, you'd look at that. Now we have all these things, these sabermetric stuff like wins against replacement, and you've got all of these other numbers you're supposed to assess whether somebody is good or not. Over the last few years, rather than just looking at pure job creation, people are focusing not just when I say people, the economists are looking at what's the size of the overall job market, how many people have left the job market, and so forth. And so you suddenly hear these discussions saying, well, if there were X number of people in the total job market, the actual unemployment figure would be this, or it would be that. And so people are now kind of discounting what had always been the basic gold standard of whether the economy is going well, the unemployment index. And so people. And their own material circumstances have not necessarily changed, or their kids are having difficulty getting a job, or somebody in their 50s had been laid off a few years ago and hasn't got a job yet. So it doesn't feel like there's actually been real improvement. And so the president is not getting what normally would be considered credit for an improving economy. Meanwhile, I think on the Democratic side, I think the president, partly I think through some fault of his own, has not really given his base reason to turn out. Over the last few years, the headlines have been things like the NSA, which actually creates splits in the bases of both parties, but I think significantly with the Democratic Party. And so you've got Democrats who are pro-Snowden, you've got Democrats who are anti-Snowden, and while they're fighting amongst themselves, where in a normal case they would be kind of bonded against how evil the Republicans are. Meanwhile, the president who ran against the Iraq War has over the last year and a half been drawn back into the Middle East. Had to deal with Syria, and is now basically has authorized airstrikes against Iraq, and that creates some serious splits again with the Democrats. You have a slightly more greater percentage in the Republicans in Congress who are more supportive of the president in terms of what he's doing in Iraq than there are Democrats. So again, you've got a split base, and I think finally, when through most of the summer the president was talking about acting unilaterally on the issue of immigration. When it finally came down to it, he decided that he wasn't going to do that. So that depresses another part of his base that might have actually, even though it would have created a furor amongst Republicans had he done that, it's harder for them to get more angry at him than they've been for the last few years. So this was a case where the Republicans kind of stayed blah because the president didn't do anything, and instead he disappointed some members of his base, and I think that may be reflective in those apathetic numbers that David spoke about. Just kind of going on from there, the places you have to look at now is basically the Senate. I'd always been somewhat circumspect on the idea that the Republicans were going to take over, and I'm not quite sure if I'm ready to predict that yet, even though some of the numbers most recently suggest that is going to happen. Perhaps because I'm somewhat mischievous, I'm kind of rooting for the idea that the Republicans end up with 50 senators. The Democrats have 47 plus 3 independents, so Harry Reid somehow stays on as majority leader with only 47 Democrats. But I just kind of like that idea because I think the chaos would be interesting to cover. So
that would of course require Vice President Joe Biden to sit in the chair the entire 2 years.
Which would be awesome.
It would be a reality show.
Which would be fun with
Joe.
Joe.
Start getting interested in Washington again if Scranton Joe is in.
What's
tie-breaking vote.
A little box on the corner of the screen
Literally
at all
just
times.
Biden cam.
What's Joe saying now?
Honestly, I mean, let's be honest, that's what we all want to see. I will sort of try and take a different tack, which is I have to say, as someone in the media, and maybe not everybody watches cable news all the time, and your minds are healthier for that. But we have spent an inordinate time talking about Joni Ernst hog castration skills, Bruce Braley and his wandering chickens, whether Mitch McConnell can hold a gun right, whether Allison Lundergan Grimes can shoot skeet right. And to some degree, that kind of stuff is part of every election cycle. But I really do feel like we have crossed the Rubicon in a distressing and a disturbing way in terms of our preoccupation with personality politics. And it feels like, last night Mitch McConnell and Allison Lundergan Grimes were debating some serious topics, and more time was spent focused on Allison Lundergan Grimes and whether or not she voted for Barack Obama in 2012 than any parsing of Mitch McConnell's answer that he would keep Connect, which is the Kentucky State Exchange, in place, but would get rid of Obamacare root and branch. Those two things are not compatible in the real world. We have become, and I think voters are, and I will play armchair psychologist in a second, but we have become so preoccupied with the sort of political gaffes that we're not paying attention to the policy substance, which is a very big problem in American politics. And so I think, that in some way explains the depressed turnout, because people either find someone they like and kind of can believe in, or they send someone they like and they believe in to Washington, and he or she compromises, and that's a bad thing, so they're voted out of office. But either way, it's not good for our democracy. I think, another part of this is, and I know I'm from MSNBC and a lot of people will take this with a grain of salt, but we are increasingly in a bifurcated world where people are listening. Facts have become fungible. And where there was once shared information that would bring us to the bargaining table to compromise, and I will say I think one party has compromised more than the other, there is now a disagreement over the fundamentals. And I think that makes governing really hard. And I think that makes, being a red state Democrat very, very hard, or being a blue state Republican, and they will be the victims of this year's midterms. I mean, 4 to 7 red state Democrats will not be going to Washington come January of 2015. And I think that's an issue, because they are in some part how things get done. To your point about the president, I think I would disagree about his base not being energized. I mean, I certainly have given plenty of airtime to Edward Snowden and Glenn Greenwald in the discussion over drones and extrajudicial killings and Guantanamo, but I'm not sure that that's actually keeping people home. I think that there's generally a sense of malaise, and I think Republicans have much better voter mobilization efforts. I think they're angrier at this president than Democrats, and certainly the base are at the president. And I think voter suppression is going to have an effect. And I'm not just saying that because I love the Brennan Center, but if you look at the numbers, I mean, there are some silver linings in I believe it's North Carolina and Iowa, where the voter registration, it seems like some Democrats have been sort of, they know what's going on and they're voting in greater numbers than they have in previous midterms. But I think that has an effect. And I think the cumulative effect, broadly speaking, since that's what we're supposed to be doing, is people don't feel like the institutions work for them anymore. And regaining that trust is going to take a long time. And I think you could say that on both sides of the aisle, there's a sense of institutional failure. And that gloom, I think, is a really powerful thing this year. And I'm going to leave it on that negative note.
We'll turn it around, though, by the end of our conversation. I mean, in a sense, that's the continued hangover from the financial crash, and the perception that so many people have of the institutions never having quite grappled with it. That financial crash gave birth to the Tea Party and gave birth to so much anger on the Democratic side as well. I want to ask one more question about the parties and any president's ability to affect the tone of an election or what it's about. We all know that what's known as a Michael Kinsley gaffe in politics is when a politician accidentally speaks the truth. At some level, President Obama said, well, my policies are on the ballot. And there are furious efforts to localize these elections, but at some level, broadly, policies are on the ballot. The role of government is on the ballot. When I was, some of you know I worked for President Clinton as his chief speechwriter. We really acted, at least, as if we believed in a different media environment that a president could perhaps help change the tone. We even had an effort to change the right track, wrong track polling numbers by boarding a train with a sign that said "on the right track" to the 21st century, and rolling through Ohio and Pennsylvania in the hope that that would change the right track numbers. We don't know if it did, but it was primitive science in those days. But could the Democrats be more coherent in articulating an economic narrative that speaks to people?
Maybe you should ask if they could be less incoherent. In a lot of ways.
But I mean, to be fair, what I have yet to see. What do you mean by that? Because I feel like they're in terms of an economic narrative, no, but I mean, really, I mean, Mitt Romney's jobs plan was basically trickle-down economics. I mean, nobody actually really focused on that. And in the meantime, Democrats are happy to throw out numbers for the minimum wage and what they'd like to do in terms of infrastructure and investment. That is not particularly sexy stuff for an election.
I think when you talk about narrative, it's bigger. It's bigger than the economy. I don't know, and Clinton tried to do this, I think, to a certain extent. That when you're president, you are also, in addition to being commander in chief and the guy who runs the government, are storyteller in chief. You're the only person who has a clear shot at defining a story about the nation, where it is, where we want to go, where we've been, what we're doing, how to get there, all that sort of stuff. And this was your job, Michael, and as poetic and as real terminology as you can put forward and to try to connect with people. And, while I think, Paul Krugman is right this week that the president's had a lot of success, one place where I think he hasn't had success, and we saw this in the 2010 election as well, in telling a continuous story about the politics of this nation. At times he has played the Republicans are obstructionistic card, and other times he hasn't. He's usually done it when his back has been against the wall, but I don't think he has really passionately and consistently, and I think that's even most important, consistently told his base and independents who might be persuaded that there's been a very passionate fight going on since his inauguration about a lot of these issues, and the individual issues matter less, I think, than values and so on. He did this during the campaign, but to do so in a way that engages people when they're not otherwise prone to be engaged. That I'm fighting for this and for these values. These people are fighting against me. Are you with me? Are you not with me? And sort of do that from the very beginning, as he did at the 2012 campaign. And it really started with the stimulus bill, when there were all sorts of groups out there who were representing the Democratic base, organizing for America and all that, and they wanted to sort of get involved in the stimulus bill and fight for even something bigger. And the White House said, no, we think we can pass this without you. Well, wait a second. The best way to build up morale is an easy win. You're going to need these troops later. You want to practice when you think you can win. And I don't think the president and his team ever figured out, and it's hard. I'm not saying this even could have worked, but I didn't see as much of an effort as there should have been to mobilize those troops and keep them involved with this story over and over again, so that now people are kind of like, when he tries to rally them, it's like, well, it seems half-hearted. And that's what I mean about sort of, could they be more coherent? I don't think there's been a coherent story.
I want to turn, Robert, why don't you go ahead, and then I want to turn the clock forward 2 months.
Just very quickly. I think the contrast you just suggested between say a Bill Clinton and a Barack Obama, I think is rather instructive here. And I'm gonna try and be as objective as possible here. When I was on the Hill, working for Newt Gingrich. We went from having taken over the House and the Senate. A few days after that, you had Bill Clinton sort of at his most down moment saying, "Well, the Constitution makes me still relevant," and so forth. And there was this kind of air of triumphalism on the Hill at that point. It was relatively speaking, less than a year later. When the Republicans are suddenly the ones that are on defense, Bill Clinton and at that time with Dick Morris, who was advising him at the time, they basically got a mantra saying that I'm not going to sign any kind of a bill that doesn't protect. It was M squared E squared. I don't know if you came up with that, Michael, but it was we'll protect Medicare, Medicaid, the environment, and education. And every time we basically the government shutdown in 95, 96 was fought on that, and Republicans got battered in the press on that, and Bill Clinton was basically we didn't realize it then, but was basically back on the road to re-election. It seems that the thing is, though, Bill Clinton, if you go back and look at his career, he's somebody who is a very smart policy guy, but he's also somebody who loves mixing it up on the political side as well. And he was able to figure out how to make a case marrying the politics and the policy. I think Barack Obama does understand policy, but he doesn't really, again, from an outside perspective, doesn't seem to like the pure politics and the wooing that is sometimes necessary with members of your own party, and then figuring out how to, broadly speaking, make the case for your party. I mean, he can certainly do it when he's running for election and re-election himself, making it the case about him, but he cannot necessarily figure out how to then do that with the broader party.
So that actually poses a real interesting challenge. So let's turn the clock forward 2 months. And of course, if the Democrats retain the Senate, we can expect much of the same phenomenon and gridlock as we have now, for better or worse. But if the Republicans gain the Senate, then it's the first time they have had unified control of Congress in almost a decade. It's actually the first time that President Obama has faced a hostile Congress. It's been a dysfunctional and a gridlocked Congress.
I mean, what's your definition of hostile?
Impeachment, passing
Listen, man, if they could have done it, yeah, go ahead.
They're hostile, but not effectively hostile.
Yeah.
So, Alex,
Yeah,
put your mind forward into that situation. How does that play out politically, and how does the Obama administration react to it?
You've skipped over perhaps what could be one of the most fruitful period in American politics, which is the lame duck session, Michael, which is obviously when anything that's going to get done in the next 2 years is going to get done. But if I don't know, I actually would solicit opinions on this, because part of me thinks, oh my Lord, if it's bad now, if you hate politics now, just wait till January if the Republicans take the Senate. Because one envisions this sort of post-apocalyptic nightmare scenario where, Paul Ryan and John Boehner and Mitch McConnell and, Kevin McCarthy and the rest of the Senate leadership, Ted Cruz, are gathering to write these horrible bills that then pass, and the president's just sort of there with the veto pen. But, and that could happen. At the same time, they're going to control Congress. And they're going to want to win the White House in 2016. And the buck stops with them in a lot of ways. And it is much easier to fire up Democratic voters and the American public when you can say, the reason Washington's broken is because of these guys on the Hill. And these guys in Congress aren't playing. But the president and Democrats can then blame all the terrible stuff that happens on one party that will be in control of the Capitol building, which could prove useful. But it requires a little bit of self-discipline to say we are not going to spend these 2 years in a post-apocalyptic scenario sending horrible bills to the president's desk for veto. I think there is going to be some bloodletting that occurs, especially around spending bills and insane riders from the likes of Ted Cruz.
So
after the 2010 elections, I remember Marty Frank said to me, this is after the Democrats lost control of the House. He said, it's more fun to be in the minority.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but at the same time, I'm not sure you want to be in the minority, because you don't get anything done that way. You also have to remember that if the Republicans win back the Senate, it will be, maybe it's the last gasp, but it will be in part because of the Tea Party. Joni Ernst, Cory Gardner, who's running in Colorado, if these two particular people win, and Tom Tillis in North Carolina, it will be people, even though people talk about the Tea Party being weakened, who really represent, the Tea Party wing, which is not even a wing. It's sort of the heart of the grassroots of the Republican Party, and so that fever will not have burnt out, which will mean it'll be very hard for whoever the Republican leader is to do anything. And you're going to have an incredibly complicated 2016 dynamic in which you're going to have three possible contenders in the Senate: Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, and Rand Paul, and Paul Ryan perhaps in the House, all trying to vie for the base, which will still be determined by how much you hate Barack Obama, how much you can block him. And Rand Paul will be having a fight with John McCain over foreign policy matters. And it's going to make, the Republican Party, even though triumphant electorally this time around, I'll be curious what you say about this, Robert, will make the civil war within the Republican Party, I think, even more inflamed.
Robert, how do you see it, and what do you think, or what do you think the Republican agenda should be if the party takes control of Congress?
Well, as David pointed out earlier on, unfortunately, Republicans didn't really run on any kind of unified theme for these midterms. So it's going to be interesting to see how they make it up as they go along. The specter of Obamacare is still going to be there, and as Alex pointed out. When it comes time for Republicans to writing the budget and they're starting to send bills over to the White House, there are going to be some of these writers attached, and the budget process in particular is one of those where you can put in legislation that basically dares the president to either veto the budget, creating a shutdown, or pass it with some stuff that he might like. my sense, tactically speaking, it would be smarter for them to identify particular areas of Obamacare that might be unpopular, that are particularly unpopular, and address those, realizing they're not going to get the president to veto the entire thing.
But don't you think there'll be some pressure from the large segments in the right to go for the whole thing?
There will be there will be pressure, and then so it will be up to if it is a majority Republican, if it will be up to Mitch McConnell and John Boehner to figure that out. I think the real wild card you've got in here is immigration. Because there's a strong contingent on the Senate side to get comprehensive immigration passed through. It's not there. It's obviously not there. Obviously not there in the House. Republican White House aims, I think, require some form of immigration reform to get passed. My view had always been that there is going to be some kind of immigration reform that the House and the Senate might be able to agree on, and then it'd be kind of up to the president to decide whether he wants.
Do you think that's going to happen before 2016?
Well, like I said, I think there are impulses, political impulses that the Republicans recognize that for presidential election years they have to figure out a way to appeal to Latino voters, and so that pressure is there. However, since we've gone through several months that starting with fights over the border, and now things like Ebola and the enterovirus and things like that, you're starting to get it's not an anti-immigrant sense within the broader. I'm not talking about the Republican base. I'm talking about the broader country right now.
Republicans in Congress. I mean, I just had
no. Just let me finish. I'm trying to make a narrow point here. There was a poll that came out. I think it was today, that there's a large majority of people who say that there need to be restrictions on countries where Ebola is active, and there need to be greater restrictions. I'm saying that there may be a growing sentiment to be more aggressive in terms of controlling the border and in controlling on people who are coming in here, and I think that could have a ripple effect on the broader immigration debate.
So let me posit something and then ask a question about what this new era looks like. I would actually suggest that we may be in for much more interesting politics over the next 2 years than we expect. A president with a veto pen is a lot more relevant than a president commenting on political trends. And depending on whether there is a national sense that Congress ought to do something, and this goes to the fractionated media, Walter Cronkite is not out there telling us it's time to act on immigration or anything else. There will be a real question of whether what Congress does, and there will be potentially clarifying fights over the direction of the country, the role of government, women's issues, and a whole host of other things that might be, at the very least, more publicly educational than we're used to in the last few years. For example, it seems to me that we all risk falling into the idea that, well, if the party of the president doesn't control the Senate, then of course no Supreme Court nominees will get confirmed. In fact, it should just be accepted that there'll be vacancies. You actually heard Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in effect, say that herself when she said, well, gee whiz, who would get confirmed if I stepped down? Well, of course, that's not only not how the Constitution envisions it, that's not how it's ever been. Eisenhower and Nixon and Reagan and George H.W. Bush all proposed and saw confirmed nominees with the party of the other with the other party controlling the Senate. So we may well see important big confirmation fights coming up that we can't necessarily envision now. That tees up 2016. We all remember how the Bork fight, for example, played out. That tees up 2016, and the question is, it will be a greater debate than we've had in a while, but what will that debate be? And in particular, I suggested at the beginning that I thought that the two parties look like kind of punch-drunk fighters. We can laugh at Republicans who have a tax cut as the answer for every problem, but the Democrats sometimes seem like every solution started in 1965 and was a new idea in 1965. So what will the answers to the problems of the country now be that either party will take to the country? How do we try to encourage some fresh thinking to deal with what the country's actually looking like today?
Well, okay, there are 5 answers that I have to this question.
That's what we lawyers call a compound question.
Yeah, exactly. The first, I think one thing that we discount when we talk about the next 2 years and leading up to 2016 is the relationship the president has with the Democratic Party. Because in some ways, I mean, the reason he didn't take executive action on immigration and why Guantanamo is still open and a host of other things is because it plays very badly for members of his own party. And as the head of the Democratic Party, he needs to look out for them ahead of November. He will be freed from that, theoretically, before 2016, unless Hillary Clinton really gets in his ear. And so I think in some ways we could see huge action on, the environment, on immigration. I think I am skeptical that the Republican Party will do anything under a Democratic president on immigration. I mean, I know that there's a fine line. And I think you make a good point. They want to own some progress, but it will be President Obama's win if it is signed into law. I also think that one of the things we're not talking about that fractures the other side of the aisle, which is the Republican side, is foreign policy, which, unsexy as it is, and let me tell you, as someone who's covered ISIS for the last 5 weeks, it is not a sexy topic to talk about, but is an incredibly substantive one, and one where there is, I think, a lot of gray area in terms of what each party would do. I mean, what we know about the Middle East is that the policy that we have now is in large part informed by the Bush years, and the Obama years will inform the next president in terms of foreign policy. And I am not sure that those policies are going to be dramatically different from one another. And so there's room for consensus, I guess you could say, on foreign policy. There's also room for a much greater debate. And I think it's going to be a huge part of the last 2 years of the Obama presidency, and will very much security, a feeling of safety is very much going to be, I think, something that's litigated a lot in the next 2 years.
Robert, when I raised this question with you the other day and said there's potentially an exciting new era in American politics, you had a pithy response.
A new political era brought to you by Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush, or maybe Mitt Romney. Yeah, I'm not quite sure whether we are going into a new political era anytime soon. Now, if it turns out that Hillary Clinton decides that she's not going to run, all bets are off, and then you might have some exciting discussion and real debate on the future of the Democratic Party. But while it looks like she's out there, that doesn't seem to be developing at all. There is an interesting debate going on, certainly on the foreign policy side, within the Republican Party, and in fact, actually, it's not just on the foreign policy side. Over the last few years, you really have seen the rise of the libertarian right, which is somewhat indistinguishable from the rest of the base when it comes to budget and stuff like that. But when it comes to national security and domestic security issues, some of the strongest voices on the right who end up getting mixed in when the whole debate over Ferguson were libertarians who have been talking about the whole idea of the militarization of the police for quite a few years. So I mean, I think that is rather interesting. And then in the Senate, you're going to be seeing Rand Paul versus Ted Cruz, or Rand Paul versus John McCain. McCain on war issues. Ironically, foreign policy, particularly in the context of ISIS and what needs to be done with Iraq and Syria and so forth, is an area where a Republican Congress and Barack Obama may be able to find some areas of agreement, because the concern that Republicans have had about Barack Obama's foreign policy is that he often seems to say, well, we'll do this, but we're not going to do this. We're not going to. There are not going to be any boots on the ground. We're not going to do this. On and on and on. I think a Republican Congress might, sort of fortify him a little bit more if it turns out that airstrikes alone are not going to prevent ISIS from increasing. So I think that's some area beyond 2016, though. All bets are off.
David, yes.
Be a little less optimistic, if we can, if we can do that.
Was that optimistic?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's anything Barack Obama can do internationally or domestically that will, win the support of Congress, of a Republican Congress. No matter what, if as long as he is not throwing 200,000 troops into Iraq, a good portion of the Republican leadership, John McCain, this means you, Lindsey Graham, this means you, Kelly Ayotte, this means you, Marco Rubio, who will find a way to distinguish himself from Rand Paul, this means you, will be blasting him. We've seen this happen on Syria. We've seen this happen in the last few weeks. They give grudging, I can't even call it praise, but grudging comments when he sort of does something, but there's always a but. And the essence of the Republican Party now, the Republican Party is really defined by its opposition to Barack Obama. Even when he supports things that they used to support, healthcare, whatever it may be, going after bin Laden, drone strikes, it doesn't matter. Because of the nature of the grassroots of the party, that's the tail that's wagging the dog. And I think no matter what happens in the election in November, that dynamic is not going to change. I don't think this fever, as I said earlier, has burnt itself out. And so, Alex didn't do this, but I'm willing to bet you on immigration that there won't be any bill passed, because at least half the party is willing to go to the ramparts against their own people should they come close to negotiating a comprehensive deal, despite the establishment's desire to show that they don't hate Latinos. So I think that that essential reality that the party now is responsive to a grassroots that has tremendous antipathy towards the president, whatever he may do, is not really going to shift in the next 2 years.
Robert, quick answer, and then I know, folks, there's pent-up,
Exactly.
non-apathetic
We can feel
demand
it.
for questions.
We can feel it.
I think I don't remember whether it was. I think it was Michael that pointed this out before. That one of the good things about having a real split government, where one party is in complete control of Congress and one party has the White House, is it does force a certain amount of clarity. If it comes to the case that it looks like if in early 2015 ISIS is about ready to take Baghdad, now that the president doesn't have to worry about putting members of his own party on the spot, if it turns out there needs to be some kind of a commitment of U.S. troops, he can go to the Congress and say give me authorization, and then he'll be able to. And if they say no, fine, that's not going to happen. But then a Republican Congress has to own that decision, and that's clarifying for all concerned.
So I do know that we do have questions. We have folks with microphones. There are also questions coming in from Twitter, and some of those will be passed along. And I've got a few myself, but we'll start with all of you. Michaela, I see someone over there. Do you need this mic back?
Thank you very much. There was no mention of money in any of this chat that we're having. David Brooks released an op-ed the other day saying money doesn't matter on a national level, he said. Then the Times today, I believe, or yesterday in the front page article, said that the Republicans are getting 70% of their money from people that don't have to identify themselves. And, you know, David indicated that that's not good. But he dwelled on the fact that money doesn't matter. I'm wondering how the panel feels about that nationally, he said.
Well, I do think money matters a lot, and there was a great piece in today's Washington Post by Mateo Gold that gave some numbers. Just looking at it here, conservative outside groups are outspending Democratic-leaning ones $191 million to $130 million. Overall spending in the election this year will surpass $1 billion, which is a record for a non-presidential year. Republican groups have outspent Democrats by about 47%. $169 million has been spent on TV ads just in North Carolina, Colorado, and Iowa, where ads aren't really that expensive. Republicans have outspent Democrats and their allies in 7 of the top 10 Senate races. Politico has a story today about the Koch brothers. Usually most of their money was coming in form of what we call dark money. It goes to groups that do issue ads, not direct candidate ads. There's not much of a difference, but they started a PAC this year where people have to identify themselves, and they're quickly raising tens of millions of dollars. And there was a great quote from a poultry billionaire who gave $1 million to this Koch super PAC saying, I'm giving money because I'm worried that my grandkids are going to be living under communism. Now, I don't know if he said it that way, but those were the words he said. And you got to really stop to think, because I'm guessing that my good friend Robert, who called himself my frenemy today on Twitter, would have to say that while people can have policy disputes and disagreements about what Obamacare means and the role of government and everything else, but it's not really a realistic fear that this country is heading towards communism. But yet people like that, who believe Obama is a secret socialist Muslim from Kenya who wants to destroy America, and so that somehow he can declare martial law and have a third term, and there are people who actually are advocating this in conservative circles. Some of them have the ability to put $1 million or $10 million or $50 million, we don't know in many cases, into races. And if you don't believe that has some impact on these races, then you don't really understand how politics works.
I would also say, certainly in the campaigns themselves, but also in terms of policy. I mean, the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, is basically writing voter suppression laws and a host of other sort of wave conservative grassroots legislation, and is servicing those to state houses across the country. I mean, and ALEC is funded by business interests. The Koch brothers have a network of organizations that they fund that work to write effectively legislation, and it is passed and it is made into law, which is, I think, a meaningful parallel track of the sort of unfortunate and distressing influence of money in politics.
And I would say that Soros and Tom Steyer and others give money
I mean,
to.
show me the crazy left wing energy policy that's been passed into law. I mean, it hasn't.
I think that, well, you know, look, it's co-hosted by Mother Jones. I was expecting this. David stole my thunder there. Yes, George Soros and Tom Steyer, who are very, very big billionaires on the left. I think David Brooks, though, ultimately is correct that in the big picture, the amount of money that ends up being spent on campaigns is relative. Is it gonna matter in in one or two races here and there? Yes. in the big picture, I don't. In the big picture, I don't think it. I don't think it does. The fact is that the Democratic committees, the DNC, the DSCC, the DCCC, they collectively have actually raised. They've actually raised more money than the Republicans have. All money together. All the Republicans raising slightly more than the Democrats. Yes, but that has a lot to do with the whole energized factor. There's a feeling that they can actually win. They can actually win the Senate. Come 2016, when it's a presidential year, I would wager that not only will, in terms of all money, I would imagine that the Democrats and the Republicans are going to be pretty equal. In fact, I would not be surprised, given Bill and Hillary Clinton's pretty prodigious money-raising ability themselves, if the Democrats actually don't end up raising and spending more than the Republicans. So I think ultimately it all becomes kind of fungible.
Well, I do think that this is a challenge for both parties, in the sense that if we don't want to just sort of kvetch about money in politics or the broken down voting system, one of the things that has to happen is there has to be a debate over solutions, and some people are for them and some people are against them. The Brennan Center actually produced the study that was the source of that article that you described. Most of the money that is now spent in the major Senate races, that is outside spending, which is the spending now under Citizens United, is what's called dark money. In other words, money from groups with secret funders, and that is brand new. And we should be, all of us should be demanding of both parties that they not just complain about it every once in a while, but really make this health of our democracy a central issue, or we will lose the democracy. And I think the Democrats and the Republicans in the past, at other points in the past, have both talked about that. And at this moment, the Democrats talk a bit about voting, but broadly speaking, neither party is addressing that systemic challenge.
I would agree with that. No, and I'm somebody who believes that there should be full disclosure in terms of money. I have no problem with that. However, I will just say this has basically been a 35, almost 40 years multitude of cycles that we've been in terms of money in politics. When Buckley versus Vallejo was passed, was decided in 1976, which lowered restrictions on lowered the Watergate restrictions on giving money. It was actually the Democrats which started the sort of the big money war when Joan Kroc, actually the widow of Ray Kroc of McDonald's fame, gave at the time the unheard of sum of $1 million to the Democratic Party to spend on elections. When the Republicans saw that, they said, okay, we need to get into this game. They created a group called Team 100, which solicited $100,000 contributions, and this just kind of kept on going. There was a little pause in the wars with McCain-Feingold, but shortly after that, yes, you did have Citizens United, but even before that, you had President Obama basically deciding, then candidate Obama in 2008, he became the first presidential candidate to opt out of the federal funding of the general election, which invited even more money to come. So it's not like it's one-sided that that the Republicans, they're evil and they're taking all this big money, and the Democrats are kind of these saints that just try and get along. Money is something that both parties go after, and if there's a loophole here and there, both parties will take advantage of it.
But to be fair, the Democrats have pushed for reform and in trying to get a hand on this, and Republicans, Mitch McConnell amongst them, have fought tooth and nail. McCain was one of the great reformers, nearly got driven out of the party for it, and sort of, as a result, has given up that ghost. And the one issue here, we talk about the numbers and whether both sides are doing it. it takes a lot of time to raise this amount of money. And so these senators, and they'll tell you on the Republican and the Democratic side just how, when you let all this much money into the system, whether it's outside groups, parties, or whatever, they spend an inordinate amount of time chasing after money. I think that leads to favor trading, but even if it doesn't, when we have these major issues to resolve, it certainly is not what we want. These legislators, they work only 2 days a week to begin with, spending, 2/3 of that chasing after dollars.
Yeah, let me just throw one more point out here. The problem with that is that McCain-Feingold, when in its so-called reforms, it ended up limiting the power of the parties themselves to actually raise money, which then opened up the floodgates for these outside groups. I think it's better if the candidate and the party has, if not control of the money in politics, at least have a certain solid amount of it, because the parties and the candidates at least have to be open about who they're soliciting from. But McCain-Feingold ended up, and then the subsequent Citizens United decision ended up undermining that, and now the parties have a whole lot less control of money coming in, and thus it's harder to hold them accountable for the spending of it.
I'm less worried about who controls the money than who the money controls.
Yes.
So why don't
if we can dial it back a few statements, I have to take issue with the statement that all these little bits don't influence national politics. Integral calculus, you integrate all these little bits and it does influence national politics, despite what David Brooks says. And secondly, we have the millionaire worried about this going to communism. I'm not a millionaire, but I'm worried about the country going the way of 5-4 votes on the Supreme Court, vitiating all the voter suppression law, or maintaining them.
Well, I think that concern over the courts is incredibly legitimate, given the fact that because the legislative branch of our government is effectively broken, the judicial branch has filled the vacuum. I mean, and like the Affordable Care Act, I mean, huge decisions that should be on Congress's plate are now outsourced to the Supreme Court, and that was never the role of the court. To Michael's point, the fact that the retirement of a Supreme Court justice could determine the future of the country legislatively is reflective of a complete breakdown in the system. And it would be nice to figure out a way to repair the legislative branch so that the Supreme Court justices are not playing the role that they're playing, which is, taking apart pieces of legislation and truly, doing the job of our elected representatives. That's all I have really to say on the court. It's a very bad state of affairs.
There are other questions. So, yes. Are you offering us the mic or a question? Or both?
I have a question.
Good.
And a comment. I mean, it seems to me the role of money in advertising is just an indication of one more aspect of the country that's been taken over by the moneyed. That if I talk to my Southern friends who are Republicans, or my West Coast friends who are Libertarians, or my Democratic friends in New York, they're upset about Wall Street, that nothing ever happened there. They're upset about the advertising. But in terms of the general malaise, I think most Americans are just depressed because they think money's taken over everything and there is no chance anymore for the average American citizen to get ahead or do anything, and they see everything within the context of that. So that's my comment, but that's a question to you because you guys haven't tied the money thing to all of these things that I see as really being depressing to the voter.
I'm not surprised. I like the way you phrase that because I actually think that there are that among Democrats, Republicans, and Libertarians, there is actually has been a certain amount of frustration with the role of Wall Street in terms of the economic crash and the fact that nothing seemed to be get done about that. Now, I think there are differences as to what should have been done, but the fact that nothing except for some kind of minor financial regulations here and there that were passed, I guess, in 2009 or 2010. But there didn't seem to be that much of an accountability of Wall Street, and even, I think both the Tea Party and the Democratic base both have a kind of a shared frustration on that level.
Can I just say one thing? I wonder, because Eric Holder, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this too, David. Like, Eric Holder has done these huge historic settlements with the banks, for billions of dollars. We had a segment on our show today. Bank profits are way back up. I mean, the money has been recouped. And there is a real question as to whether, this administration and the Attorney General should have actually whether criminal charges should have been filed, whether someone should have gone to jail, and whether that was even politically feasible. Because in theory, the finalized settlements represent, quote unquote, the end to that chapter. And yet, to your point, for most Americans, the question mark is hanging in the air.
Well, and it's clear to me that it was the Democratic base, to a certain degree, maybe beyond that, Occupy Wall Street, with the people who were concerned about justice in this regard. And I know in the White House that they struggled with this, particularly in the year or two after the crash. The question was, well, if Wall Street does kind of hold us hostage, which it does through our pension plans and 401ks, and so much of our economy is tied now to financial speculation. If you start prosecuting these people, do you end up having unintended consequences that hurt the little guy? And you can make an argument either way, but there was that concern. On the Republican side, to be archly partisan about it, there was no internal conflict over this. In fact, the Republican analysis was that the crash happened because of government, because of too much regulation or too much taxes. And it wasn't, they refused to see the need for financial reform. Not that they didn't just like, aspects of Dodd-Frank. They just didn't want any of it. They wanted nothing. There was no alternative Republican plan to Dodd-Frank, not a single one. So there was a stark difference here. And this is one instance where I think, I get back to my earlier question about the president being a storyteller that wasn't told in a clear enough form to get that, to explain to people what was happening. And to, just half a thought, an issue that we haven't talked about, which is, I think plays into this, is that there is, undeniably growing income inequality in this country. And I think people are worried about that, fearful of it. And they also see it not being fully addressed. The president has, talked about minimum wage, which I think helps to a certain regard, but doesn't help, middle-class people who are making above minimum wage already. And so, we talk about 1%, but there is a growing gap, and I think that's very disaffecting for people, very alienating, and they're seeing all the institutions out there as being aligned, rightfully or not, with that 1% they feel cut out.
And there is really interesting new scholarship underscoring what seems self-evident, which is that the broad policy preferences of so many people are not reflected, systematically not reflected, in what government focuses on, in Congress, in what it does. When you look at attitudes toward the minimum wage versus attitudes toward the capital gains tax, and which gets the focus from Congress year in and year out, it even goes way earlier. The disaffection goes way earlier than 2008 in September. There's a broad sense that the public has, which leads to people being angry or resigned or saying enough or saying forget about it. So do you have, we have time for one more question from the audience. The gentleman right on the aisle there has been patiently waiting. You're going to make us soar with optimism with your question.
I hope not. Actually, mine's strictly a question. I live from across the river, so I'm in a different country, New Jersey. And we're talking about the midterm elections and what's going to sway it and what the net effect is. And I'm looking at the midterm elections, and I'm looking at the 2016 elections. So you talked about Rand Paul, Ted Cruz, McConnell, nobody mentioned Chris Christie.
Who?
So the question I have...
We'll cross that bridge when we come to it.
That's why he's the improv guy.
So the question I have is, Does Chris Christie factor into this midterm election in any way, aside from the fact that he's running for president in 2016? But is his running for president, then affecting this, this year's midterm? And then is he a factor in the 2016? Because you've mentioned all these other names.
Try and keep this quickly. There's a lot of hostility towards Chris Christie in the Republican base because of his literal embrace of President Obama in the post-Sandy period, and that hasn't completely worn off yet. That said, there are a lot of the big money people, some in New York, but also across the country, like Chris Christie. He's the head of the Republican Governors Association, so he's been crisscrossing the country, raising money for Republican gubernatorial candidates. So he's sort of trying to collect some, putting in some chits, possibly for 2016. I don't know if I would put him in the maybe the A level category of candidates, but he's a certainly strong B, and depending on what other things that happen, he could still be a player there. And that is, by the way, all jokes aside, that is assuming nothing comes out for the GW Bridge stuff.
And actually, to be optimistic, if you want to be optimistic, the one potential bright spot for Democrats this election is the governor's races. Yeah. Talk about Chris Christie, because if you're looking at Wisconsin, Michigan, Florida, Pennsylvania, I don't know if I'm missing one or two others, there are some, the Democrats have good odds at unseating some very high-figure, prominent Republican governors, whether it's Rick Scott, Tea Partier in Florida, Scott Walker in Wisconsin. And so, if we're talking about long-term change for Democrats, having governors in place in a presidential year is very important. They have machines, political machines to some degree. Senators and representatives don't. So helping a Democrat win Florida, if Charlie Crist is a governor, could happen. And looking even further down the road, right now, for the Democrats to take back the House, if you look at the national vote combined, they'd have to win about 55% of the vote because of the gerrymandering done by Republican-controlled state houses and governors. So if you're talking about balancing this out down the road, you're going to need governors and state legislatures doing it differently. So electing a few key governors now might be the one ray of hope. I'm giving you people the very end of this for 2014.
He's giving you people that. I would just say one thing. We talk about how everything is broken, nothing's happening. The two places in the American democracy where things are happening are at the state level and in the courts, right? The who controls the state house is hugely influential in terms of where the country goes. Look at Kansas and Sam Brownback. Look at Jerry Brown in California. I mean, that's where legislation is happening, legislation that affects the entire country, may I say, like in terms of not just the mood, but where gay marriage, abortion restrictions, environmental regulations, all of that no longer happens in Congress. It is happening at the state level. And curiously, maybe distressingly, maybe optimistically, I'm trying to hedge my bets here, 36, I believe it's 36, 30, is that right? Yes, the total number of states ruled by a single political party is 36, which is the highest it has been in 6 decades. So
22 are Republicans,
yes,
right? So they still have
I think
22, 23?
13 Democrat, 23 Republican. So yeah, I mean, and it really matters. You see what happens in Kansas, conservative experiment. You see what's happening in California. That's where the action is. Is that optimistic?
That is optimistic.
I guess.
I will leave you with 2 notes of optimism and 1 note of late introduced alarm. Just to keep you excited as you go out to Washington Square. 1 note of optimism has to do with, and I never thought I'd say this, with Chris Christie. One of the key factors to make American government work again and politics work again is to have in the Republican Party, in effect, a kind of reform movement, the Reformicons, as they're called, which we saw within the Democratic Party after repeatedly losing elections to Ronald Reagan. You started to see some change. That was what Gary Hart thought he was doing. That was what Bill Clinton thought he was doing. Chris Christie, among other things, is seen as a candidate who shakes things up in terms of the ideological pulls within the Republican Party. The challenge is it just a kind of a moderation, or again, is there a real challenge to some of the shibboleths that will keep the party losing and losing? That's one note of hope, is the stirring there. A second note of hope is I think that there really are some issues where there's been extraordinary progress and cross-partisan progress. You mentioned gay marriage. What an extraordinary thing that it's not a wedge issue. It's not even an issue. It's sort of a almost a consensus issue.
Unless you're Mike Huckabee.
Unless you're Mike Huckabee. But one area that the Brennan Center works on where there is genuine and intriguing bipartisan cooperation is criminal justice reform, where Rand Paul is one of the real leaders on the issue, and where Eric Holder, as the leading voice among the Democrats, has really talked about what we can do to undo some of the policies that have led to us having 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population. There are strange moments when those kinds of things can create huge progress. Those are the two hopeful parts. Let me throw a note of alarm, which has to do with damage the Supreme Court hasn't had a chance to do yet. Last week, somewhat unexpectedly, the justices took a case from Arizona where they have been asked to declare all redistricting reform, in effect, unconstitutional. In other words, the creation of these state redistricting bipartisan commissions, or certainly the commissions created, as Arizona's was, or California's was, by referendum, by the people saying to the politicians, hey, we don't want you picking your own district lines. The question is whether the Constitution actually prohibits that. As we look forward to the year 2020, to the next redistricting, you could find an even worse situation where, let's face it, Democrats and Republicans, the only reason the Republicans did this gerrymandering is because they got to it first. In other words, the Democrats have done it whenever they've had a chance. We may face an odd situation where the chance to foreclose that may be closed off. So that's the note of unexpected alarm. It's something we're working on. We actually need to close. I know there are a number of people with questions, and we apologize to you for not being able to get to them, but it turned out that for all our bemoaning the apathy and distressed mood, there's actually a lot to talk about and to argue about and to care about. And we will all be intrigued, at the very least, to see what happens over the next few weeks and in the election. I want to give a little preview of something that is happening here at NYU that an organization called Why Tuesday is setting up, which is to try to encourage students to participate and to pay attention to how low voter turnout is and what we can do to improve the election system. There's actually going to be a contest with some real rewards, meaningful rewards for students who kind of get in the game of guessing turnout that they'll be announcing through NYU in the next week or two. So I would like to thank our panelists for being part of this conversation today and for being part of the conversation that we're all so thrilled to hear and read the rest of the week and the rest of the year too. We're really grateful to you for being here. Thank you. And I want to thank my colleagues at the Brennan Center, especially Janine Plant-Cherlin and her colleagues who staged this event and help make our communications with the world what it is. So,
Thanks, Michael.